Once we got this going, I know a couple of stories that fit in there.
There's the stool.
And as long as we got
I'm
the
gonna give
time.
you about
5 minutes.
5 minutes, and then we got MB on.
So, in going along with what Maxine was saying, I've heard stories over the last many, many years too. Your father-in-law, Bob Higgins, was quite an historian with the lake. And our other neighbor, Bud Blakely, down on Lake Lucerne Drive, has also done a good little bit of research. And I don't recall whether it was Bud or Bob that had the newspaper article. Now, evidently back in the 50s and 60s, there was a Snellville newspaper. And they had an article in there that they showed me. This has been 25 years ago. That talked about Lake Lucerne. And they were interviewing two gals that lived down around where Bud Blakely lives now. And this was in the late 50s, early 60s, I guess, before the community was developed. And they, like Maxine said, yeah, we planted corn down in the bottom. We planted cotton on the higher ground. And they had been there since the early 1900s, these two gals had. And they'd grown up there in this house, and neither of them had ever married. And their parents passed on, and they inherited the house. Well, when they interviewed them in the late 50s, early 60s, evidently, they were in their late 70s or early 80s. So they've been around a while.
Who were they?
I can't recall the name. I don't recall the name. But we got to dig that out. It's in the Snellville paper, though. But so the story went on, and they asked him. They said, "Well, you know, y'all been here a long time, and you've seen a lot of things transpire here in this community." Said, "What do you remember?" Said, "Well," said, "in those days there was just a little old gravel dirt road out here that went out to Athens, and wasn't much traffic." And talked about raising the corn and the cotton. Said, "Yeah, we had bears out here, and deer. They'd seen bear and deer both. And it was very secluded, and there wasn't very many people." And they talked about the Phillips having a fancy motorboat that when they finally put the dam up, that they would ride the motorboat around. And occasionally even ski, they claimed.
Really?
What? Ski? You know, water ski. But they said, well, now, and evidently these gals were somewhat famous for making the remedy. And they'd been making the remedy for many years, and it was known in this part of the county to be a good remedy. And some people came from miles around to get their little bottle of remedy on a regular basis. But they asked him, they said, well, we've seen a lot all over these years, but the most exciting thing that we ever experienced was when the spaceships came to take on water. And both of them agreed. They said they'd seen this phenomenon occur ever since they were young teenagers, which was in the early 1900s. And they said their parents would get them up at night, and they'd go out on the back porch, and they'd look down, and there was evidently some water down in here even in the old days, that even before the dam was here, that there was a pond type area over here, and that this spaceships would come and shoot a beam of light down into the water, and it appeared as though water was going up that beam of light. And they assumed, the gals assumed, that the spaceships were taking on water. Well, that was a pretty logical assumption. Trains ran on water in those days, so, and cars did too. Some cars did, so maybe that was true. And they said, well, when's the last time you saw them? And they said, well, it was the late 30s, early 40s. And so it had been 20 years previous to whenever this interview was occurring. So that's about the last time we've seen them. And so that was an interesting little bit of history there. And they said, oh, they came at least once a year, sometimes more than once. And they said it was quite a sight. They had made no noise. There was no noise. And it was a saucer-like
Yeah,
craft.
there you go.
There was remedy-driven memories.
Maybe it was. But
I
both
think
of
they've
them,
been
both of them,
drinking their remedy.
Yeah.
they may have been, but both of them saw the same thing
Oh.
multiple times. And even since they were little girls, and they said it was a saucer-like craft that had lights along the rim of it. So that was interesting. And we don't
One more
know.
minute, one more minute. I'll be there.
We don't know if there was a mill here or not, but we do know that there are mill stones that were found in the lake. In the process of dredging this time, 13 years ago, we uncovered several millstones, and some of them went to Orville's house. And I think Orville found some even before the dredging, and found one or two of them. So, and they were not huge millstones, but that size, which is,
And we have one in the garden that
Yeah.
Carol
Yeah.
contributed.
so.
There you go.
And the other thing about Miss Phillips evidently had a shotgun she was fond of using. And if somebody was trying to catch her fish and hadn't paid, she'd get out there and pop a few rounds off, get their attention. But that's all the fill in I've got.
Thank you. All right, Miss MD?
I have one question. Do you know why it became part of Lilburn as opposed to Snellville or Stone Mountain? How that occurred?
I do not.
Because Ms. Banks kept talking about, people from Snellville and so forth. It seemed logical that this would be an extension of Snellville.
Well, the people around here all went to Snell